mornings in the future, look for the word adult forum. And Ken will be teaching for the first 3 weeks. And we have some other people coming, and it'll be really fun this year. So I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Ken Sawyer, who works at McCormick Theological Seminary downtown. And he has been here before, and I hear he's really good. So I will be in the back taking notes. Okay? Have fun.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to see you all, and so glad to be back here in Deerfield with a new sound system and new needs for adjustments. So good to see you, and glad to be back here in this vibrant and caring congregation, a congregation of conscience, a congregation of engagement, a congregation that hits above its weight and has impacts that you don't really know about or realize because of your own faithful engagement. So I'm glad to be back here. I'm glad to be in conversation with you for these first 3 weeks of this return to campus. So welcome back, and thank you for your welcome back for me. I'm glad to be here and glad to have been in conversation with Maddie. I'm glad that you're here in this congregation to learn how this small slice of the whole people of God, how they serve and how they witness and how they teach. This is a good congregation to be a part of, even if temporarily, because of the lessons to be learned here. So thank you for your warm welcome. Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome. Here's a handout for you.
Thank you.
So again, thank you. Glad you're here. I think we won't be displaying, but we will be in conversation. And I have a handout as a recovering librarian. I always have a handout for you. And in our second week and our third week, there'll also be a bibliography, since again, as a recovering librarian, a document without a bibliography is a waste of paper, right? So, and we'll be together then for these first 3 weeks, and I'm hoping that the 3 parts of our conversation can each be sufficiently provocative to be part of a productive week. I like that characterization. You characterized this last week as productive. That's good. So my hope is that our conversations here during this adult forum will also be part of productivity and engagement and provocation. And also some points of reflection that I hope will be part of your preparation for worship and your continuation of your lives of service and engagement and conversation with those you love, those you meet, and those that you assist and are in solidarity with as well. So I bring greetings from my president and dean at McCormick Theological Seminary. I teach on the south side in Hyde Park, and y'all should come down sometime and see about us in Hyde Park. There are good things happening at McCormick Theological Seminary in these days. And these are particularly good days to be going to seminary as well. These are years in which seminarians are needed, and the training at seminaries like McCormick is needed for this particular time. And I'm trying to lure Maddie down to my Presbyterian history course that will be next spring, incidentally, that even good Episcopalians need to study Presbyterian history. More on that later. Thank you. My president, McCormick's president, David Crawford, is from Lake Forest, and Steve Davidson lives out in Oak Park, and a few of us on the faculty are right there on the south side. The school is in the shadow of the University of Chicago, and it's a wonderful place for a seminary to be, especially in a broken city like Chicago, a city needful of the liberative and encouraging word of the gospel, and needful of the constructive word of coping with the difficulties and challenges of our time. I spent this past summer, oh, that's right, I also bring greetings from my parents, my mother and father, Presbyterian elder William T. Sawyer, my father, and my mother, Jeanette Sawyer. They just moved from Texas to Chicago, South Texas, where they were for the last 50 years. And so keep them in your prayers as they're making their adjustments, not only to the city of Chicago, but life with my family. So they've been very generous in their opening weeks in Chicago, and it may be that one or the other of them may join me next week or the week after that.
They could have had a free bus ride. They could have had a free bus ride.
I'll need to find out more about that. And yes, thank you. For us, in conversation, I spent this summer with my parents in Texas, and then we moved together, moved them to Chicago. The town that they live in Texas is just a stone's throw away from Uvalde, the little town that was torn apart by the shooting in the public school. And as you consider in your own prayer lives, that town is suffering so much as the students return to school and the parents continue to struggle with the realities of the violence that erupted in that little town. So I'm in Texas while the madness of coping unfolded, and same weeks that the shooting took place in Highland Park as well. And so I know that this congregation has been moved and is struggling and seeking to be of use, of service, but also seeking to be open to the reckoning that the Spirit brings in response to such violence and such difficulty and such trauma and such pain and such loss. So I appreciate the fact that this congregation is here and that it's made up of women and men of conscience, of spirit, and of substance, and that you're here in such a time as this for the challenges of these days and for the needs of the people in Deerfield and in surrounding villages. So I'm grateful for your witness and your engagement here, and I'm hoping that our conversation may be part of your meditation and preparation, and I am hoping that this will be of some help and encouragement and empowerment to you as well. So, welcome. Here's a handout for you. Hi. Nice to see you. Thank you. All right. So I do some teaching at Stateville Penitentiary, and I was down there last week, and one of the students said, "We're continuing to pray for you, Ken, for your recovery from your injury." He was remembering a joke I had made at an opening class where I thanked them for praying for my recovery from the injury to my thumb for pressing on the photocopy machine. All the photocopies that I would bring down to them. So my thumb is doing well, thanks. I'm healing well, thanks. The physical therapy just means just stay away from the photocopy machines, right? So on this handout, I have 3 illustrations, and we'll talk a little bit about them. Of course, on the right is a picture from your own sanctuary, and it's so nice to walk through that sanctuary this morning with the windows open, with the world welcome but bounded, so that the sacred space finds its way into the wider world, and the wider world, quite properly, is sacralized and blessed by being part of the sanctuary. So the center image is an image of Constantine, the emperor, the most powerful person in his world, and the vision that he said that he had, where he saw Christ sponsoring him and telling him that he would be successful in the name of Christ. And indeed, even the term "go and conquer" in this sign, the sign of the cross, was part of his vision, right? And then, in contrast, earlier on, one of the earliest images of Jesus, iconic forms of Jesus, is the image of Jesus as the Good Shepherd, right? So how we can relate these 3 images, I hope, will be part of our conversation, and some of the opportunities and temptations that characterize communities of faith, I hope, will be part of our considerations and conversation in these weeks. I'd like to talk about resources and temptations because those 2 words capture so much of the clarity and also some of the confusion that characterize congregations. So I will be defining these terms. My wife last night said, I'm not sure I could define donatism, so we'll talk about that in our time together. My point as a historian, I teach church history at McCormick and anywhere I go, my point is that we are in need of exercising our historians' muscles or conscience or sensibilities, and that it is a peculiar time in which we need the instruction and the lessons of history in an era, in a time, in a culture which is teaching us and incentivizing us to forget about the past, to ignore the lessons of the past, to ignore the wisdom and the insights and the blind spots of the past. And so we may need to become increasingly countercultural and better historians, and to live into some of the wisdom and strengths of the psalmist, like in the psalm that says, I will tell an old story, an old and dark story, stories from the past, and will teach those stories to the younger generation. I mean, each of us has a particular responsibility, not only to our contemporaries, but also to the young people that we know and meet and care and worry about. And part of that is to enjoin everyone we meet to become better historians, better citizens, better Christians in the process. So, some of you may know the contemporary historian Timothy Snyder. He is an Ohio native who teaches at Yale University. Some of you have used his little book on tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. Timothy Snyder, among other things, points out that we can no longer take history for granted. We can no longer take factuality for granted, that we live in dangerous times that have been characterized by some as post-factual. I mean, when a president's advisor can speak of alternate facts, then we within worshiping communities need to take notice, because our very lives, our very faith, our very future is rooted in an understanding of God's mighty acts in history and the working out of God's redemptive, loving ways in our lives, in our cultures, in our communities, in our families. And so we may need to reorganize ourselves such that we need to commit ourselves to speaking of factuality, to speaking of history, to speaking truth, to speaking of truth as a category, not just my truth, your truth, but of a truth that is shared within communities and is capable of withstanding assessment, contention, dispute, and which calls all of us to a higher discipline rather than the partial to speak of the whole, and rather than the half-truth to speak as much of the whole truth as we dare, and to allow the transformative power of truth to both judge us, but also judge all of us in the room and all of us within a particular conversation. Right, Timothy Snyder, he'll be on the bibliography. I didn't want to scare you with a lengthy bibliography right off. Right. So, for us as well, you're beginning a new year here at Deerfield, and this is the first time that you've been together rather than outside. You've been in, but it raises a good question. What about the calendars that you're following? You spoke of new sporting events, that the sporting calendar has begun, right? The academic calendar has begun in the public schools and private schools. But what about the other calendars, the calendars that run through the living memory of Judaism, the living calendars of Islam, the living calendars of Christianity as well? How is it that time is marked and sacralized by the calendars of the church year? And how is it that Christianity and Judaism and Islam, among other lively faith traditions, are in conversation with one another about time and about the organization of time? And how is it that our own overtly secular lives can also be in conversation with the sacred times of worshiping communities? So I'm glad you got up this morning and decided to come and be together in this room. It matters. Thanks for getting up. Thanks for coming out. Thanks for sitting down together. Thanks for putting up with one another and putting up with a Southside stranger who decided also to come to be with you. Thank you. It matters where you spend your time, how you spend your time, and how it is that you consider time as a gift, but also time organized in accordance with God's profligate love for the world and God's mighty acts in history as well. So, whose history? And how distant is history? I guess it was Faulkner who said the past is not really past, that so much of contemporary conflict is rooted in historical realities that might allow us to, if we didn't know what decade it was or what century it was, we'd say, oh my goodness, are we still stuck in the 19th century? Are we still stuck in the 1840s? Are we still stuck in arguments that are more deeply rooted in the long corridor of the history of the church? Well, yes, we are. And the more we know about the past, the more equipped we can become in coping with contemporary disputes as well. Whether disputes about the nature of human nature, the nature of the cosmos, the nature of the passing of time, the nature of power and governance, or the nature of personal witness, piety, and prayer. All these things are also rooted in the historical stories of the church, but also an understanding of the placement of the church placed in the world. What's your image of the church? I remember one time I came up here and was talking about images of the church, I mean, they vary. They all have their own history, too. What is your image of the church? I mean, frankly, as I was walking around this beautiful campus, this lovingly maintained campus, looking at the ways in which those who take care of this campus were making a welcome for you this morning, I thought, my goodness, this is a powerful statement. This is a statement of care and concern and preparation and welcome and hospitality. It's a beautiful place. And so is the church a beautiful place? It should be. The church should be a place of beauty and of compelling beauty. And many of us have given up on the category of beauty. And frankly, driving up on the Edens, I was thinking, well, beauty is not the last word, is not the first word that comes to mind to describe this ribbon of concrete that runs north from my little village to yours. Or the business center, could be a little more beautiful. But this campus is beautiful. Anyway, what is your image of the church? Irenaeus, at the end of the 2nd century, said the church is like a garden. I think that's a beautiful image. He said the church is like a garden in the desert, like an oasis. The church is a place where you can go for healing and for contemplation and for rest and for preparation for the next set of tasks. That's an interesting image of the church, isn't it? Tertullian, about the same time, said the church is like a courtroom and God is like a judge. Ouch! Right? Oh, okay, thanks. Tertullian from Carthage in modern-day Algeria talked a mean game, so he liked those kind of militant images. The church is like a courtroom, and God is like a judge. Or many years later, someone like Erasmus, his image of the church was the church is like a school. The church is like a school that we enter the school not knowing what we should know and knowing some things that we need to unlearn, but the church is a school and Christ is our teacher. That's a good image too. Do you have any other images? Any other images that come to mind?
The church is people.
Church is people. Mm-hmm. Right. In some ways like a bus station, right? The church as a Grand Central Station. Or as the Ogilvy Center, downtown, those of you who take the train into the city. I mean, in some ways, the church is like this gathering of people, right? It's wonderful.
Like a family.
Or a family, right? That the church is like a family. And of course, as you know, some families are more functional than others, right? So I like that image. It's good because some families are dysfunctional and some congregations are too, right? Right? So, and then the pastor needs to be more therapist than pastor, right? Anyway, that's its own story. Yes, please.
I think of the church as a launching pad and also as a stake in the ground.
As a what?
A stake in the ground.
Uh-huh.
Holds stakes to the kingdom.
As a launching pad, that's a wonderfully rich image, or as a stake in the ground, or say, this is where I stand, or a holding company that says, right, this is where you are prepared for better, bolder things too. Not a hiding place, but a place of preparation for bolder things.
Wasn't me, but somebody said, I can't remember who, you'll know, a hospital?
Right, thank you. Augustine, or Augustine, let's decide. What's it going to be? Tomato, Augustine, Augustine, same guy, right? So he said, the church is like a hospital where sick people come and get better and become more like the Lord we confess. So, right, lots of different images. Courtroom, classroom, launching pad, a stake in the ground, hospital. Right, how it is that image informs our way of getting along with one another, indicates the power of metaphors and the reach of the imagination as well. My hope is that there's enough of each of these models to inform and encourage your life within this congregation, but also as you observe the struggles and strains and resources of other communities of faith as well. Images of the church then, and stories of the church allow us then to have an understanding, or a better understanding, or a little bit of light cast on our current moment, our current era, our current time. Since we're not really about the business of recreating a time or a church that would fit into an earlier time. Although if you turn on the television and listen to some messages, theological messages, it's as if people are being prepared for a church from the 1850s. Or if you go to some seminary curricula, you would say, oh, you're being equipped to serve a church from the 1950s. Ouch. I mean, what are we about? Are we about looking back, or are we about bringing the resources and strengths of the past into service of the present? In some ways, we need to be liberated even from the successes of the past, so that we might become open to the new work that God is doing, the new ways that God is calling us to be, and the new welcomes that we are asked to offer to those who either haven't been welcome or haven't been visible within our own communities in the past. I so love your image of this kind of mixing bowl, right? And like all the people, right? Which people? And who's welcome? Are all welcome? Do we mean that? I mean, I'm part of a segregated community on the south side. Oh, I'm sorry, right. I'm an American Christian, and so by and large, I'm part of congregations that are typically homogeneous in their makeup, right? So mine is a homogeneous congregation on the south side, an African American congregation in Bronzeville. So it's a typical American congregation. The question is, how do we connect with other congregations? How do we challenge the homogeneity of our own group? And how is it that we live into a fuller understanding of the fullness of the church, made up of all God's people in every place, and all those who are chasing after the same confession, the same blessing, and the same hope and yearning for community, healing, and fullness of the measure of the stature of Christ. Right. I think there are some challenges and some temptations, and that's what I'd like to talk about for the next few minutes. The mandates of our times and the resources of our tradition allow us to observe some of the strengths and some of the blind spots of our tradition. And so I'd like to talk about a couple of issues and a couple of temptations that characterize the history of the church. Church has been around for a while, 2,000 years, and there are a couple of really great strengths and a few continuing blind spots that continue to bedevil us. We need to ask ourselves to what extent are we a community of memory, or have we dedicated ourselves to forgetting the past and refusing to learn from our own past? There are a number of temptations that I think suggest a number of ways out of the costly discipleship and conscience that characterize this congregation and others. Is faith for spectators, or is faith an expression of being a participant observer? You said you went to a cross-country meet this week? How was it? How'd you do?
Got a lot of exercise.
Right, so, I mean, did you wear your new shoes with the spikes, or did you wear your flats?
The old,
And so how'd you do in the competition?
I watched.
Oh, you watched.
I did not.
You didn't run. Okay. All right. Right. Well, is the church like that? I mean, the church would say, come on, put your shoes on. Come on, run the race. I mean, Paul uses that image, doesn't he? Right? So is the church a group of spectators, or is the church a group of participant observers? And I'm glad you didn't join in the race, but you get my point, right? That we are called to come into conversations that may be uncomfortable for us, and we are called then to be faithful witnesses even beyond our comfort zone and in new ways as well. Thanks for observing. Christian communities and believing communities are communities of engagement, and not only of observing and watching and waiting, but also of joining, doing, and being. So thanks for joining and doing and coming in this morning. But you'll be hearing more about different ways of witness and work together in this community. Our temptation is just to opt out and to be in the room, but not to be part of the conversation. Or to say that has to do with them, but not with us. The cynic would say, well, right, you can get my body in the room, but you won't get my attention or my spirit. And that option is always apparent, right? You've met folk who will not be coaxed to engage, but rather will retain their right and privilege of observing, judging, and maintaining their distance. And yet, the gospel calls us to a life of costly discipleship, and of risk-taking, and daring, and yearning in some ways that would challenge the cynic, would challenge our own cynical impulse, and ask us to join the dance, to join in, to risk a bit, and to invite, to encourage, and to introduce ourselves to new and novel realities. Okay. Is the story solely about us? Right. I mean, that's kind of the opposite of the cynic's standoffish way, right? Some folk will put themselves right at the very center of things, in which it's kind of hard for community life, isn't it, if everyone's the main actor? If every story is about me, then I may be less able to learn stories of others, or I may lack the empathy that allows me to observe the different life experience, life struggle, life stories, faithful yearnings of other persons, that I may be just imposing my own experience on someone else, right? I don't know if martyr is the right word, but you've met folk who are insistent that while it might be Jesus on the cross, it's really them. that a better story is told about their own sufferings, their own costly and somewhat self-indulgent ways. Right. Okay. What about risk and compromise? Our nature, understanding the nature of the church here, I think, is well placed in the conversation about these three values: peace, unity, and purity. It's part of the set of questions asked of all those who become officers in the PCUSA. Peace, unity. We're asked to pursue those three. But these three are in some ways held in tension with one another. You can't really have all three simultaneously. You're going to put them in some kind of order as well. Peace, unity, and purity. The temptation is to opt out and say that the church is made up of just those people who agree with me. I call this the Donatist temptation because the Donatists, that's a movement from the early church, named for a guy named Donatus, and his understanding was that the church is made up of people who were as pure as he was. So again, in questioning your image of the church, Donatist view of the church was that the church is made up of the pure. His great opponents, like people like Augustine, would say, well, no, the church is made up of it's a mixed group of people, and that it's up to God to sort things out. In some ways, Donatists would say that the church is like a can of cashews, and Augustine would say that the church is a can of mixed nuts. Right? So how mixed is your understanding of the church? How pure does the church have to be in order to meet your standard? Or have you given in to the Donatist temptation of rendering it impossible for people less perfect than you to be part of your community? It's a challenge for all of us, right? The Donatist temptation. Or the Gnostic temptation, the temptation to veer into conspiracy theories, to explain what's going on. I mean, you see a lot of that. I was in the South this summer, and there's a movement called the Patriot Church. The Patriot Church has so conflated the national story with the gospel that they are true believers that there is a conspiracy to take over the nation. That joins them with Gnostics throughout history. Yeah, I love it. Mention the word Gnostics, and there's the sound of thunder. Thank you. I like that point. The Gnostics would say that only the few understand the gospel. The Gnostics would say that this is a hidden conspiratorial knowledge that is passed down from teacher to student, and that only this tiny group of true believers can really know that story. The church stood against the Gnostics for a variety of reasons. First of all, the church proclaims that the gospel is available to everyone, and that the gospel should critique any kind of elitist understanding of teachings, and that it's not a secret. God's good news is not a secret, and God's good news is not kept solely for an elite group, and God's good news is not just for those with PhDs, but that those with the least cognitive capability are also capable of recognizing God's love, God's presence, God's purpose. So the Gnostic temptation takes a variety of forms and is still very much with us. Anyone have their dog-eared copy of Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code? Gnostic, that there's a secret story that, that's an entertaining novel, but it's a novel, it's not history, right? Or anyone watch the Matrix movies? Gnostic, right? That we're all asleep. Well, it sounds like folk who have heard my lectures, right? No, we're all asleep, and that we need to be woken up to tell us who we really are, to escape this world into some sort of Gnostic cosmos. Oh, that the story of the gospel critiques conspiracy theories and urges us to pay attention to the more mundane story of God's people in the world, and the more startling story of God's loving transformation, presence, and promise in the world, to challenge the Gnostic temptation. What about the Pelagian temptation? Pelagius was a contemporary of Augustine, and he was so upset with Augustine for a variety of reasons. And maybe you'll recognize a little bit of Pelagius in the American story, because the American story is basically a story of Pelagius. Pelagius says we are independent moral agents, and whatever we do on our own. And whatever we're judged on is because of what we've done. We make it on our own bootstraps. We make our life and we explain our lives, and whatever we have, we've earned. Wow, that sounds good. Augustine says, oh no, it's a little more complicated than that. That before I even knew God's name, Augustine said, my mother carried me, and I didn't know what was being done for me. Before I knew what was right and wrong, others who loved me into a community that was interwoven and interdependent, and so that each of us receives and builds on what we have received. Pelagius says, no, we stand on our own 2 feet. Augustine says, no. In fact, we are part of one tribe, one story, and that our experience of God's grace depends on people we don't even know, and and gifts that we don't even know we are receiving, and benefits that flow to us, or harms that flow to us from others. We are part of one story. That's a repudiation of the Pelagian temptation. Okay. What about the fundamentalist temptation? As someone raised among fundamentalists, I can speak to this. Absolutizing in a contingent world. You know, in the 19th century, those who sought to defend Christianity against its critics tended to go in 3 or 4 specific ways. Roman Catholics absolutized the church and the infallibility of the Pope when speaking ex cathedra, absolutizing the contingency of human judgment, right? Protestants absolutized the Bible, especially at Princeton, where in the 19th century, a very 19th century way of defending the Bible was, oh yes, the Bible is infallible, inerrant, especially in the original autographs of the original manuscripts. That's interesting because the original autographs don't exist, right? So you've neatly removed the critique from the comparative field of evidence, right? In some interesting ways, Pentecostals and holiness folk elevate human experience to a nearly absolutist status, so that the experience of God's grace trumps, if I could use that word, trumps the scriptures or tradition or institutional accountability as well. Interesting, the ways in which our temptations to absolutize the contingent may lead us into error as well. The fundamentalist temptation. What about our reading of the past? Some of us may be devoted to chasing after a golden era. We're just not sure where that golden era is. Or golden arches. Sorry, it's just a joke. Just a joke, right? When I first moved here in 1978, I was shocked to come to Deerfield and to see that they were hiring at McDonald's at $12 an hour. I moved here in 1978. I went to Trinity. I was looking for work and just shocked by the high wages here on the north side. And then I was down at the Starbucks this morning, and they're hiring people at $15 an hour. Wondering about golden pasts. So how the past, how the present, how the future are imaged, how they are discussed, and how they are sacralized can lead to what I've called an imperial temptation. We may sacralize a particular era, a particular generation, a particular economic period, and not realize that nations are also in the hands of God. I mean, again, if we go back to Augustine, in the year 410, when the barbarians invaded Rome, and all these faithful Christians were saying, how on earth could God let Rome fall? I mean, Rome, the city of the apostles, the city of promise, the city of protection, how is it that God could allow Rome to fall? Augustine said, well, right, it's a tragedy. It's terrible. This is a terrible set of traumas that have happened. And yet we need to recognize that God is not dependent on the survival of the Roman Empire to accomplish God's purposes, and that God is bigger than a particular nation-state, empire, or project. We may be tempted then by the imperial temptation to suggest that God is dependent on the preservation of this particular group, this particular economy, this particular nation state, right? The imperial temptation. Or lastly, the establishment temptation. That is to say that we have arrived. I observe this. I mean, some have talked about the savior complex in mission work, for example. If we send people somewhere else to do God's work and make sure that they go somewhere else so that we are not challenged by their mission work, then we've accomplished some good things, but we've also exempted ourselves from the transformative mandate of the gospel too. So mission or community or daring or chance-taking may be abbreviated or challenged by this establishment temptation, as if we have arrived and we no longer need to pay attention to the call of God, the call of Christ, for our transformation, for our continuing conversion, for our transformation as well. The establishment temptation. So these are some challenges, I would suggest, some temptations that characterize the history of the church, but also if you look around, you see some of those temptations characterizing today's church as well. Now, when we gather together next week, I'd like for us to focus on the Reformations of the 16th century, and especially our particular strand of the Reformation, the Reformed folk, and some of the resources, insights, but also some of the blind spots of the Reformed tradition, and the provision of resources for us for our own walk today. I mean, this is a Presbyterian congregation. It is rooted in the Reformations of the 16th century. It is routed to the realities of the post-Reformation histories, and it is constituted by y'all who come from a variety of backgrounds. Some of you raised as Roman Catholics, some of you raised as Moravians, some of you even raised as, Lutherans. Right. But now you're here, so how is it that the strengths and goodness and insights of those various traditions can also be part of and enliven and not be erased, but rather be added to the goodness of the charism and identity of this congregation? What is the part that you bring? What is the charism and gift that you bring to the mix that is this congregation? That's part of what we'll be talking about next week. So I'm looking forward to that. But I'm wondering, having spoken too long and said too much, I'm wondering if there are questions or comments along the way. Please. All right, questions, comments, or denunciations. Right. Do any of those temptations or aspects of the past speak of your own tradition? Some of you were raised as fundamentalists, like me, and have been seeking healing ever since. Some of you have been raised in Donatist churches that are so separatist that you wouldn't accept anybody to your congregation that didn't agree to your doctrinal standards. Some of you have been raised as Pelagians, raised as being bootstrap individualists who and taught to earn your way and leave aside others, and that the purpose of the church in some ways is to heighten the connections and interconnections and interdependencies of everyone's life, including yours. And some of you have also been raised within traditions that are characterized by what we've called the imperialist temptation, and may have mistaken our national strength for spiritual strength, or our defense budget for the defense offered by God's provision, or imagine that the stars and stripes really are connected with the stripes of redemption, right? So these are challenging questions. Questions or comments, denunciations? Maddie, you say, how dare you, Ken? Come all the way up here to Deerfield. All right. So next week then to the Reformations, and again, I've withheld my bibliographies, but they'll come next week. All right. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
But you are welcome to stay. I don't know if you're planning to, but.
I